You can see in this popular clone 717 picture of plates here that the control and the GRF columns do look quite a bit different. I want to draw your attention to this explant, which I showed before, but this time I want to bring to your attention the large size of the callus here compared to a lot of the other explants. A lot of the GRF explants produce quite large callus, whereas you can see here in the control, there are quite a few shoots beginning to develop, especially in the stem explants, whereas the GRF stem explants are still only in the callus phase. This is one of the possible negative aspects of the microRNA resistant vector, is that these cells might get locked in an earlier phase of development, such as callus, and be unable to move into the shoot phase. In Poplar clone 353, this effect is even more dramatic. You can see that there are quite a few shoots in the control column on the left, but in the GRF column on the right, there are far fewer shoots and they are much smaller. This leads me to our possible conclusion, which is that microRNA resistance may indeed hurt regeneration, especially shoot formation. In this graph here, the y-axis is the percent of explants with a transgenic shoot, and in clone 717, you can see that the overall effect is basically zero, but there's also a lot of variation between the three replicates, which is, again, another reason that we need to repeat these experiments again. But in clone 353, we have a conclusive result, which is that the GRF chimera appears to strongly inhibit shoot formation, which is actually the opposite of what we wanted. So Eucalypt clone 21.1 shown here has much the same result. You can see that there are shoots forming in the control on the right, but the GRF explants are still producing just very large calli. The same thing in Eucalypt clone SP7. I apologize for the poor picture quality here, but the control is starting to form shoots. And in the GRF explants, we just have these massive callus. However, there might be a slight boost in callus production in Eucalypt, which may or may not be good, depending on whether or not these explants can produce shoots. But there appears to be a modest benefit in Eucalypt SP7. But in 21-1, there's nearly a twofold increase in callus production, which is a promising result. In the future, I'll be testing the wild type or microRNA sensitive citrus version, as well as the microRNA resistant grape construct. Both of these are from our colleagues at UC Davis, who published that paper I showed earlier. In addition to those, I'll also be cloning the Poplar and Eucalypt native versions of these genes to see whether or not there is an advantage to using the native gene over a foreign gene. I'll also be shortening the length of the experiments from 8 weeks to 4 weeks to test simply for callus production, and those constructs that show the most promise in callus production will then later be taken to a much longer experiment for shoot production. In summary, regeneration remains the primary bottleneck for transformation of forest trees and many other plants, in fact. microRNA-resistant constructs may indeed harm shoot formation in Eucalypt and Poplar. But finally, additional tests with different constructs are necessary, especially the microRNA-sensitive versions, which we will be testing shortly. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming to my talk, and I welcome your questions.
Thanks so much. Great job, Nathan. So if anyone has questions for Nathan, you can type them in the chat or you can raise your hand, and one of us moderators will unmute you so you can ask him directly. Any questions from anyone? Is that Tap? Let me unmute you real quick.
Hi, thanks, Rach, and thank you, Nathan. I like the visuals. My question is that since I'm coming from totally different background, but I'm tech, I'm FES faculty, but genetic operation. I was in it. I know how they work, but I don't work on it by myself. So as a master student, it's probably difficult to answer this question, but I probably want to know what is the big picture here, and then how do you put it, knowledge gap that you try to fill with your amazing, I think it's really nice, the experimental design. So I just want to know, if you can explain the point of your work to someone that don't have much background, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I'll try to get this right. There's a few people in here that can correct me if I'm wrong, but like I said, the primary bottleneck in genetic engineering in trees is simply that a lot of the genotypes that people want to grow, a lot of these clones that are globally significant, are just really recalcitrant to regeneration. And so if we can find a gene or a couple genes, these developmental genes that aid regeneration, then potentially we have a situation where, say we want to introduce an insect resistance gene, we would simply insert that along with these developmental genes, and then it would allow for a much higher regeneration rate. At least that's the hope. Although this lab has been doing research with these developmental genes for quite a long time now, and yeah, we still don't have the gene that we're looking for.
Thanks. Good luck then.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more really quick question from Matt Powers.
Hi, nice presentation. I was wondering if there are proposed mechanisms for why you see this, reduced shoot formation effect that you were observing with, I think it was the poplar. Anywhere in the literature or anywhere out there, is there some kind of mechanism that might explain that?
Well, this gene has only been in the literature a little bit and fairly recently. However, like I showed in that diagram of all the different genes in this network, it's really just hard to predict what upregulating one of these genes is going to do to the rest of the network. And even if you think that it's going to repress this other gene, which may enhance regeneration, you just really don't know what other effects it's going to have. And so my guess is that it's just upsetting this network in a way that we didn't expect, or a way that isn't productive.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and sorry we don't have any more time for questions. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Xavier Tacker, who is going to be presenting on CRISPR modification of floral genes in eucalyptus and impacts on flowering structure and pollen development. So it sounds like we're continuing on the gene expression line of thinking here. Excited to hear more. So you can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, one moment. I just need to close out this window. Okay, great. My name is Xavier Tacker. I'm an undergraduate researcher representing the Strauss Lab, and today I'm going to be talking to you about CRISPR modification of floral genes in eucalyptus and how we assess their impacts on flower structure and pollen development. On the docket for today, I'll be covering the project background, methods used, as well as results, conclusions, and some next steps. Beginning with the project background. The Forest Biotechnology Lab at Oregon State University is concerned with modifying tree physiology and genetics to aid in breeding propagation and research. We're particularly concerned with genome mapping and genetic engineering of eucalyptus and populus, where flowering is a key focus. On the right here, you can see a flowering field trial of our populus. Some broad project goals. Number one, we'd like to assess the efficiency of CRISPR in eucalyptus, which I will get to in a second. Number two, we would like to select genes to produce diverse effects on reproduction. And number three, we'd like to determine the impacts of gene knockouts on vegetative and floral traits, which is what I spent most of my time on the project doing. The rationale for the project comes from a three-step approach. Environmentally speaking, we'd like to mitigate gene flow of eucalyptus. In plantation-style forestry, eucalyptus has long been considered an invasive, invading into the surrounding ecosystem and essentially wrecking biodiversity and forest composition. By mitigating gene flow, by inducing sterility, we hope to contain eucalyptus to the plantation. This research builds upon a recently published paper disrupting the leafy function in eucalyptus, which also imparted sterility. Building upon this study, we would like to impart sterility while retaining floral structures, as leafy inhibited all floral structure development. By retaining floral structures, we hope to create amicable neighbors in plantation-style forestry that will be able to nourish pollinators with their flowers and pollen. From the social aspect, we hope to create publicly acceptable organisms, opening the door economically to many other modifications for forestry purposes. Now I'd like to talk with you about CRISPR, as it is a key for modifying target genes. CRISPR is very simple and only requires two pieces to it. The Cas9 nuclease, seen here as this big purple protein, acts as a pair of genetic scissors that will snip the genome at a desired spot. The guide RNA, that only requires a 20 base pair change, which is extremely easy to do, assists the Cas9 nuclease in knowing where to cut the genome. The result is genetic engineering, transformed trees. And I'm sure you're wondering, how are we able to study flower structures in trees that take several years to reach flowering age? Well, we do this through flowering locus T overexpression. In a paper that our lab published, we had findings that flowering locus T induces flowering earlier and at greater rates with no inhibition on floral functionality. This results in images like the top right, where you see eucalyptus flowering in a pot, which is admirable for even the most fast flowering species, let alone a tree. I would next like to get into the methods and talk about how we were able to pull this all off. Beginning in the methods, we have our gene selection. Arabidopsis biology powered our search, as it is the lab rat of the plant world, the most well-researched and well-mapped in genetic regard. We searched all through the eucalyptus genome pictured in the bottom right to find matching genes that we had also studied in Arabidopsis. Once we found these genes, we ensured that they were single copy, meaning that when we mutated them, we were likely to have success. The genes that we selected were TDF1, which is known as tapetal development function. In a functioning plant, this will regulate pollen formation and dehiscence from the anthers. Inhibition of this gene, we hypothesize, will result in male sterility by inhibiting pollen formation and dehiscence from the anthers. We also selected meiotic recombinase 8, which in a functioning flower regulates meiosis. By inhibiting Rec8, we hypothesize bisexual sterility, as pollen and floral meiosis will be disrupted. Finally, we have embryonic development arrest 33, which in a functioning flower allows for seeds to be detached and fruits to be developed. Inhibiting this, we hypothesize female sterility, as seeds will not be able to fall from the plant. Pictured in the top right, we have a CRISPR construct map. And as I had mentioned before, those guide RNAs, we have two of them to ensure that we have a perfect knockout. Next, I would like to talk about how this genetic transformation actually occurred using CRISPR. Here's how it works. We create a construct, as seen here, and we transform and regenerate trees, as Nathan had talked about earlier. From regeneration, we use PCR gel analysis to amplify the genes and see if our knockout was successful. We sequence the target genes and align them, and then finally, we phenotype them, which is what I spend a majority of my time doing. Moving onward and getting closer to the floral study, which I'm so excited to talk with you about, let's first visit the greenhouse growth study. The greenhouse growth study was aimed at studying the vegetative growth of subject trees with our knockouts without the presence of FT overexpression. As I had mentioned earlier, FT overexpression results in earlier flowering. We wanted to test the genetic modifications of EDA33, Rec8, and TDF1 in wild-type trees without the FT overexpression. We wanted to see if they would grow in a desirable manner or not. Do these KO mutations impact the vegetative growth is what we wanted to know. Moving on to the floral study, and pictured here, we even see a flower. You'll see a more high definition picture of this flower in the next slide. The floral study has two parts, flower morphology and pollen analysis. The aim of the flower morphology study was to document the effects of constructs on morphology of subject trees. We did this by collecting buds from the greenhouse at various stages of development seen at the right in this figure and comparing them to control specimens after dissection. This image and work is courtesy of fellow lab worker and undergraduate Sonali. Thank you. Next, we're moving on to pollen analysis. In pollen analysis, we want to answer a few questions, and we do this through two sub-studies. In the pollen production and viability sub-study, we would like to know how much pollen is being produced and if these pollen are viable. And then in the in vitro germination sub-study, we would like to know if they're germinable. I will be spending today talking to you about pollen production and viability. Pollen production and viability has an aim of qualitatively and quantitatively quantifying the viability of pollen in subject trees as compared to controls through viability staining. And at the right, we see a stained image. I'm sure you're wondering why some of these pollen are this weird magenta color, and I'll get to that in just a second. This is made possible through Alexander's stain, which actually does the differentiation between viable and non-viable pollen for us. The stain stains for protoplasm, which is only present in non-aborted viable pollen. This is because pollen reaches a developmental stage where it acquires protoplasm when it is considered viable. The stain will stain viable pollen magenta, and non-viable pollen will remain translucent as it is absent of protoplasm. Next, I would like to talk with you about the methods of the pollen production and viability study. We collected samples from the greenhouse, stained them for viability, and processed the samples, filtering out debris for the most pretty and crisp images. We fixed them, and then finally, just finally, imaged them and counted them for viability. And I'm sure you're wondering how I'm able to count this whole image. Well, I do a little bit of a workaround, and I only count a piece of it. I create parameters like seen here so that I only count a certain window, and the window stays the same in every single pollen subject that I count. I look for first these viable pollen grains. These viable pollen grains are seen here, and they are red magenta-y color. I then count their counterparts, the non-viable pollen, with an emphasis on finding pollen to count that is only triangular shaped. A pollen grain like seen here would not be counted as it's not triangular and hasn't reached the proper stage of viability. Next, I would like to talk with you about the results to date. The results to date are divided between controls and knockouts. In the controls, we have our wild type, which had the highest rates of viability at 99.7%. This is what that might look like. All the grains in this image are stained. Moving on to our FT overexpression only constructs, we see a drop in viability to 28.1%. Contrary to knee-jerk beliefs, this is not because of any inhibition to floral structure and functionality through FT. As I've mentioned before, FT does not inhibit either of these functions. Instead, this is because we used a hybrid, and hybridization often results in low viability in pollen. Moving on, in TDF1, as hypothesized, we had no data to even count. There's no pollen, and this is what we had expected of TDF1, as the pollen would not be released from the anthers. Onward to Rec8, we see pollen but at extremely low rates, and all the pollen is considered inviable. I would also like you to pay close attention to how many of these pollen grains do not fit that triangular description as I had mentioned earlier. This is because the Rec8 inhibition results in pollen that doesn't reach the proper stage of development. Finally, a bit of a surprise to us, in EDA33, we also noted no pollen. Referring back to earlier, we had hypothesized that EDA33 would result in female sterility. Surprisingly enough, we're getting findings that suggest that it also results in male sterility as well. I'd now like to talk about some conclusions to date. So far, these constructs and knockouts are doing what we want for the most part. In TDF1, as hypothesized, we have seen male sterility. In Rec8, we have seen at least male sterility, and we will wait to hear back from Sonali over at Flower Morphology to know if Rec8 also imparts female sterility. But as a surprise to us, we found that EDA33 imparts male sterility as well, at least. We think that this is possible through different gene functions in Eucalyptus and Arabidopsis. Regardless of the surprise, these findings are also all very exciting because Eucalyptus and Arabidopsis are millions of years apart in evolution, but still have the same genetic functions in these genes. I'd like to next talk about the next steps for this project. We will continue data collection with expansion into germination, next data analysis, and then finally publication within the next year or so. I'd like to take the time to thank everyone in the lab that helped on this project, specifically Michael Nagel, who created the genetic construct, Eli Jewell, who helped with some of the early methods, Dr. Steph Iloriaga, who oversaw the project, Alexa Nino de Rivera, who did all the organizing that my brain could not even fathom, Greg, who helped me learn how to use the microscope and was my go-to math person, Kathleen for the transformation techniques, and of course, Dr. Steve Strauss for overseeing it all and helping me get to this point in my presentation process. Thank you all. I'd also like to give acknowledgements to the Mentored Employment Program for funding my research and the USDA NIFA grant for the research in general. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have them, please put them into the chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. I have a question from Mark Needham.
Yeah, nice job. I'm just curious as to, in terms of those next steps, what part of that you'll be involved in at all? Because I think you're an undergrad, right? So like where does this, what are the next steps for you in this?
I believe that I will continue viability counts as well as looking into germination if we deem that is something worth our time. I don't know if I have the statistical aptitude to do much of the data analysis. I can give you some averages, and with a couple of hours of struggle, maybe in a notebook, but that's about all I can do. I think the rest is up to my superiors to determine, but I can count some pollen. I can do that for you.
Good job. Thanks, Xavier.
Probably do have time for one more. I actually had one question. I just wondered if maybe I just didn't catch this, if there's any hypothesis that you guys have for why you saw that unexpected result of male sterility accompanying female sterility in that project that you mentioned.
Forgot to unmute myself. That is a good question, and that's something that we are looking into right now, actually. Greg is the one that's overseeing that and looking into it. But from what we can tell, we hypothesize that there's just a different gene function in EDA33 and eucalyptus. We had looked into seeing if we had missed the mark on the gene, but we think that we hit the target correctly, but that it might just have a different function in eucalyptus than Arabidopsis, which isn't too far-fetched to think as they are, as I said before, millions of years apart in evolution.
Gotcha. Thanks. That's great. All right. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to our next presenter. Thanks very much, Xavier. And that is Carver Heine. So I'm going to make you into a co-host here. And you can go ahead and share your talk slides whenever you're ready. Carver, about impact of classification algorithms on modeling forest ground from point clouds. Take it away whenever you're ready, Carver.
Thanks for the intro. Okay, so I'm Carver, and I'm an undergraduate student studying forest and civil engineering at OSU, and I'm here representing the Management Algorithms and Remote Sensing Lab, along with Bogdan Strimbu. And I will be talking about the impact of classification algorithms on modeling forest ground from point clouds, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll go into it. So what is the project objective? The project objective for us was to determine the differences between algorithm and algorithm parameters when generating digital terrain models from point cloud data, and also to show the impact of selecting specific algorithms and parameters for DTM creations and the results that follows those. Just to give a little background on what point cloud data is, it's a collection of 3D points that represent an area or object. And each of these individual data points have values assigned with them, and they can be classified on various characteristics. You can see in this image to the left here, it's a group of trees that have been classified based on elevation. So the blue color represents lower elevation and the red is the higher end of elevation. And you can even make out the shapes of the individual trees there. And earlier I mentioned a DTM, or digital terrain model. This is a crucial piece for any kind of engineering work that uses GIS technology. And what it is the ground data points that other measurements are based off on. And I think this image sums it up really well, where you can see that there's all this data on the top. Included are the cars, trees, buildings, and those little shrubs there, which obviously aren't part of the ground. And if you were trying to measure the height of those things or the height of something else, those points might get in the way. And that's what we call a digital surface model. And then below that is the digital terrain model, which kind of eliminates those as reference points, and then heights can be properly measured off of the actual ground. And so just some of the uses, specifically the forestry related ones for DTM are the tree heights. So it's really nice to be able to measure tree heights and volume that way, which can be done much faster with an aerial drone measuring point cloud data rather than sending someone out there to do it by hand. It's also really nice for road layout. As you can see, this image to the right is a more topographical image, and it makes it really easy to see where you'd want a road to be laid out. And also in the next bullet point, where water would flow or other mass movements like snow and avalanche. And there's even some new technology hoping to include it in vehicle navigation, to where your car can more closely match your phone going over large land features. And so my project is all based on algorithms, and so I'll just give like a little description of what an algorithm actually does. It's basically a succession of steps aimed at reaching an end goal. And some of the point cloud classification algorithms, which are the ones that I was working with, are the SMRF, the simple morphological filter, which is the one that I'll be discussing today, the PMF algorithm, which is the progressive morphological filter, the CSF algorithm, which is the cloth simulated filter. And there's a lot of other ones, but I would say that these three, along with the Axelson, are the main ones that people use. And so what is the purpose of my specific algorithm that I've been using for this project? It's basically to separate the ground from the rest of a point cloud. So on the left here, you can see an image of a stand out by Panther Creek, where it's gray, or it's classified by elevation again, with the blue at that bottom of the hill being the lower elevation, the red being the higher elevation. But it's kind of useless because you can't see any of the actual ground to take measurements off of, and it can't differentiate between what's a tree, what's not a tree, if there's any rivers or large cliffs or any other type of land features. And then to the right here is a couple different angles of a completed scan using the algorithm. So the green classification is the actual ground below the trees, and the red is on top of the trees. And then from here, we would be able to separate out the trees from the ground and base the measurements directly off the ground. And so the SMRF algorithm has several parameters that basically change what the DTM will look like as the end result. The first of those is cell size, and that's basically a grid overlay on the actual point cloud itself. And that cell, each cell has a certain number of points that lie in it, and you can change that size. And we chose 0.5 meters squared, 1 meter squared, and 1.5 meters squared. The next parameter is the elevation scalar. And this is basically to account for elevation extremes. So you would change it based on what the topography of the land looks like. So really steep features like cliffs might be hard to detect as ground because they change so rapidly. And then another modification factor similar to the elevation scalar is the slope, which is the rise over run, which is, like I said, the steepness between points. And so again, if you had really steep features in your land like cliffs or really gentle hills, you could change this, and it's actually percent, so 1% and 15%. And the elevation threshold is similar to the slope, but it only measures the vertical distance. So point A to point B within a cell, and again, these are in meters. And that would be the difference in points the vertical distance points to tell whether it's ground or not. And the last characteristic that we have is the max window, which is the number of cells per iteration. So when the algorithm runs, it basically selects a group of cells, calculates each of these parameters based off that to see which points do meet the minimum requirements and which points don't. And so changing that obviously changes all of the other parameters as well. And so with three options for each parameter, it leads to a total of 243 combinations. So it was a lot of number crunching, which I'm thankful that Dr. Bogdan-Strimbu was able to help out a lot with. And so I'll give you some numerical results first, and then I'll move into the pictorial results, which are much easier to kind of understand. So on the left here, we have two different algorithm outputs where one only had one change parameter. You can see at the bottom there, it's this max window from 15 to 18. And that basically outputted two different DTMs, and they were very close together, with the midpoint being the rough distance between the points. And that's in meters, so about a quarter of a meter apart, which is really close. And the count is how many points were overlapping between the two. And this point cloud, I think, was around 600,000 points. So, or 6 million points, excuse me. And so they had a lot of overlapping points, and that's shown in the density characteristic as well. And then on the right, we have two different outputs with three parameters changed. You can see the slope factor, the elevation threshold, and the max window were all changed as well. And that the midpoint you can see is much further apart. 27 meters is a huge number. They have very few overlapping points, and also the density is extremely low. And so these results are kind of reflected in this pictorial example, which is two different algorithm outputs. And I believe this example, there's only two parameters changed. And it's a little hard to see on the top view, so I zoomed in on the bottom view a little more, and you can see where one algorithm is picking up some number of points where the other algorithm isn't picking up, and vice versa. And so there's these large differences, even with very, very small changes between the algorithms, which could pose as a big problem if you're trying to take measurements off of, and one has some height for something, and then it would be a completely different height for another algorithm. In conclusion, these parameters are very important in delineating ground from other objects. And looking at all of the data, it seemed that the driving parameters were the slope and elevation threshold. That's probably because those are most effective with large features, like I said, such as cliffs or gentle hills. Those will really change what the DTM looks like, and especially if there's trees on it as well. Trees can really easily be perceived as cliffs if they're like really steep because they're vertical. And changing the algorithm is expected to have an even larger effect, which is hopefully what further research were involved, because these tests were only done with the simple morphological filter. So changing other algorithms would produce a much larger impact on what the DTM will look like. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation. We actually finished a little bit early, so we have plenty of time for questions. And please ask away, everybody, in the chat or raise your hand. Kudos going in the chat.
Oh, hi. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is basically like this. So it seems like what you're trying to do, which is basically try to separate above feature ground from the terrain. And that sounds really like basic stuff in terms of, I mean, basic means it's not easy. The basic means it's really fundamental stuff for remote sensing using this technology. And then I wonder this kind of thing have been done considering the prevalence of this data set. And then I wonder if that's the case, or if it's basically my question is what you, I don't think you're reinventing wheels, but I'm kind of wondering what your research is really adding to the existing knowledge or the technique.
Yeah, so there's a ton of different algorithms, as I said, to find out generate these DTMs. And so, yeah, I haven't actually made any of the algorithms. Basically, what I'm trying to do is compare the parameters and how altering one parameter could alter the DTM, or in the future, another algorithm could alter the DTM, and getting to which would be best for which type of ground, or why one is better for one use by another. So it's more of like a broad comparison of algorithms rather than trying to find a specific one.
I'll follow up on that answer with a related question. So could you provide an example of how you would evaluate which algorithm is most appropriate in the context of a particular problem or question that resource managers or planners or whoever might be facing?
Yeah, so I've only done work on the one algorithm so far, so I can't speak to comparing between algorithms. But as far as parameters go, it makes a large difference. Like the window size and the elevation factors, kind of what I was mentioning before, where if you were working with a stand that was really, really steep, you would want to adjust your elevation scalars and slope thresholds accordingly. Because if you were to have it as a very gradual sloping factor, then the DTM might not be generated at all because the entire ground would be steep.
Carver?
Yeah.
It's the predation was decently short, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
Or shorter rather than longer. But I have a question for you. Now that you just started working on this project, like what do you think that will be the most challenging part of the rest of the research, the rest of the work that you have?
I think the most challenging part would be like the statistics side of things. It's a lot of statistics to calculate, and I think having like a really good workflow for the organization of that is tough just because there's so many combinations to work with. And then once all that data has been compiled, I think learning to apply it into the right place. So as far as choosing which place to or choosing which place for which algorithm would be ideal would be hard too.
Please feel free, everyone, to ask any additional questions. We still have a couple minutes left. I actually did have a question because you mentioned that this building these models can be helpful for determining where ideal road placement is. I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more, like how it helps with that.
Yeah. So like let's take the example where the entire area would be covered by forest ground. In that case, it might be hard to perceive the topography under all those trees and, maybe other features that would get in the way. And so by being able to kind of remove that top layer of vegetation, it's much easier to see like where the best placement for a road would be. Staying along ridge lines or, avoiding ways that water could drain right onto it, stuff like that.
I see. Thank you. Well, I'll give people a couple minutes to filter in and out of other presentations, and do ask any additional questions if you have them. And then we will move on to the next presentation in a couple minutes here. And everyone, just a reminder that you can give feedback to any presenters whose presentations you watch by using the Give Feedback link on the virtual conference space underneath the presenter's name, and they'll receive that feedback from you. And if you're a student, it's also a raffle ticket to get a card for Peak Sports. So yeah, make sure to fill those out before the end of the day. Do a little bit more shuffling around. Our next presenter is going to be Todd West, and Todd, I have made you the co-host. So if you would like to share your screen now, you're certainly welcome to do that. I'll put a spotlight on you so people can see you as you're talking. We do still have just a couple minutes until that talk starts. I don't want to start you early in case someone is going to join right at the beginning. I don't want people to miss the beginning of your presentation. So if you guys want to just, stand up.
Yes, I figured a few people have expressed their enthusiasm for starting anyway to me in the chat.
Okay, so it is time for our fourth presentation from Todd West from the Department of Forest Engineering and Resource Management. He's going to talk to us about heuristic optimization of thinning individual Douglas-fir, pollen behind the scenes. Looking forward to it. So go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So last month, Bogdan, John, and I published a paper on using numerical optimization methods called heuristics to maximize the value of Douglas-fir rotations by doing individual tree selection during the thinning. So the way this works is we set up 8 different heuristics, which you see plotted out here, and they go through a sequence of educated guessing and eventually converge on some maximum land expectation value. And this process of figuring out exactly which trees do you remove in thinning, which trees do you harvest at final rotation, is a little bit different from previous thinning studies because it's just more granular and provides more precise control over your silvicultural prescription. You can see that all of these methods produce very similar land expectation values. So the main conclusion of the paper is it doesn't matter which heuristic you choose for the quality of your results. So most likely you will probably want to use one of these 2 that are called hero because they run the fastest, so you spend less time waiting for your computer and more time getting on with all the other things you have to do. And we believe that the reason that these results are all very close to each other is because we used Organon as the growth model for predicting the silvicultural response. And Organon is non-spatial. So if a heuristic goes through at one time, it says, why don't you thin that 30.1 centimeter Douglas-fir? And the next time it says, why don't you thin the 30.2 centimeter Douglas-fir? The stand level response is going to be very similar, even if those trees are on opposite sides of the stand. What happens then is, as you can see, these blue lines here are the range of heuristic thinning prescriptions, and they're all quite narrow. So the heuristics consistently add value over more conventional thinning prescriptions that are shown in the other colors. Which trees you select is sensitive to the log prices you're getting, what you expect for timber forecast in the future, and also the harvest costs and haul costs for the unit. Additionally, there's this implicit assumption by Organon that past levels of disturbance and weather are good predictors for future. With climate change, that's a bit questionable. Kind of the tradition for this sort of analysis is to neglect that. And we caution in the paper that by pursuing numerical optimization for just financial value, there may be compromises to other ecosystem services. And before you go and manage to this prescription, you need to check those things. So what I wanted to do in this talk is just to spend a few minutes explaining kind of the big idea behind this paper, and also look at a couple of different ecosystem services besides just the money. So I call it the idea scan and plan. What's happened with sensing technology is that if you have some trees and you want to figure out some good ways of managing them, it's increasingly easy to get lots of data about what those trees are. And it's also increasingly easy to give that data to a model and let your computer chug on it and find out what some of your options might be. One place to start with this would be to use an aerial scan from airborne LiDAR or drone, and then segment that up to probably identify 70 to 90% of the trees in an even age Douglas-fir stand, and then complement that scan from above with a scan from below during timber cruising as you're preparing the sale for thinning. And because by the time this go through the sale process and the harvest contractor actually gets onto the unit, likely something's going to be different, it's probably valuable to scan it again from the harvester as well. And the idea behind this is really to provide decision support about if you have a particular management objective in mind, what's the best way to route the equipment through the unit, particularly the first time you're doing a thinning and it's a pretty dense stand, and which trees should that equipment take out. So the scans tell you where all the trees are, and if you have geo-referenced harvest equipment, it knows where its processing head is, and it's able to cut the trees that are determined specifically by the heuristic. So this helps offload the equipment operator a little bit because they got to run the machine and figure out all of the other things that they need to do and are hampered by trying to only look at the trees they're selecting from below without that help from the scan from above. So this would ideally make the life easier, as well as giving the landowner a little bit more tools about, okay, we'd like you to go do this on the unit. So as an example for this talk, I set up a pretty typical Douglas-fir stand in the Coast Range and went through as just a control, 360,000 combinations of first thinning age, first thinning intensity, second thinning age, second thinning intensity, and rotation age. And from the standpoint of financial maximization, you go through and pick out the ones that have the highest land expectation values, which, depending on the discount rate you're applying for your analysis of your planning, gives you this set of solutions here that are indicated in the bolder lines. And you can repeat the same thing with the heuristics. The heuristics in this case looked at about 75 million different prescriptions. And in all cases, they were able to find one that has a higher financial value. Additionally, this maybe opens up a little bit more operational flexibility in the sense of you can say, well, if this is what I was doing, I now have some things where I can choose to extend the rotation length or even shorten the rotation length and still yield a higher return off of the harvest unit. And that might allow you to maybe prioritize some other services or something like that. The way this works kind of in the stand is if you start with some diameter class distribution of trees, that's the lines up here on the top, and then the shaded area is what's retained after the thinning. So on the proportional thinning that we're using as a control case here, the removal is just a constant fraction across all of the diameter classes. And on the heuristics, you can see what the heuristics are doing is they are preferentially removing the largest trees in the stand. So this is something you might be tempted to call thinning from above. However, thinning from above often applies just a diameter limit and then cutting everything above the diameter limit. And that's not what's going on here. There's a relatively complex set of decisions about this size of trees we're removing at this intensity. And this is just more detailed than other analysis that you often use 1, 2, maybe 5 diameter classes, rarely 10. In this case, this particular analysis is run on 450 trees and effectively 450 different diameter classes, one for each tree. I want to emphasize that this is a bit distinct. A lot of times that we talk about thinning in Douglas-fir over the past 20 years, it's been in the context of biodiversity, where you're trying to recruit large trees or structural diversity, and that's not what's happening here on the financial optimization side. The large trees are the ones that are coming off the unit. So this is consistent with previous works that have used less detailed analyses of thinning and have found there's an opportunity cost for the biodiversity. Another thing that comes up oftentimes when you start talking about, well, maybe we want to do longer rotations is the idea of carbon sequestration. And so a check on this is, well, if you optimize just for the money, what happens in terms of the biomass that's on the stand? This is maybe about 44% of the live tree biomass is actually carbon. And you can see, for the most part, most of these heuristic solutions are keeping more carbon on the unit on average over the entire rotation than just doing proportional thinning, but not always. And in some cases, lengthening the rotation actually results in less carbon. So that's something to be careful of. For more complete analysis, you need to look at what's happening with the wood after it leaves the mill and soil carbon and a bunch of other things. What we took away from this as the folks doing the experiment is we're continuing to see that the heuristics are converging within a fraction of a percent. So the numerical methods are very precise, but what that means is that the silvicultural decisions you're going to make are only as accurate as the models you're using. So I mentioned at the beginning those confounds with Organon about it's a non-spatial model and it's assuming a constant climate. In particular, the funding that supports me prioritizes developing a spatial model, including wildlife habitat as consideration and also wildfire behavior, and as well as we'd like to work on a bunch of other factors to improve the model too. Something that we've also seen in this analysis is we compare Organon's regional calibrations or other models' regional calibrations to the actual measured data from our study site, is that there is a need to assimilate that data from those initial scans when you're preparing the sail into the model calibration, have a site-specific model in order to get that accuracy up to where it's competitive with the precision of the decision-making tools. So that's something I'm also working on. Other major theme is just the numerical methods themselves, with tens of millions of simulations to come up with one of the figures that you saw here. That takes a few hours. And start adding in non-financial objectives, it's easy for that number to climb into the hundreds of millions or billions. So finding ways to not do so many simulations and also to make the simulations themselves run faster is something I deal with on a day-to-day basis just to get work done. And also we hope that it'll make it a more useful tool operationally. And back to that sensitivity piece I mentioned at the beginning, there's uncertainty about what happens with disturbance in your stands. What happens, is there a log price shock? Are there some regulatory changes that affect what you can do silviculturally? And all of those can yield more simulations as you are looking across this range of possibilities that you think might happen and are trying to identify, look, I'm gonna make a decision about thinning now, and 2 decades from now, is that still gonna be a good decision? What can I do as a robust prescription? So having spoken to the things that we're doing about some of the ways that we'd like to handle uncertainty here, I'm happy to take any questions that all of you might have about things that you're uncertain in regards to what I've just said.
Thank you so much. So yeah, anyone is welcome to put questions in the chat and also raise their hand if they'd like to be unmuted and ask their questions verbally.
Looks like Matt has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. I'm trying to ask you to unmute. Hopefully it's working.
There we go. Should be unmuted.
Yep.
Thanks for the presentation, Todd. It's interesting. I find myself wondering, though, whether it's worth evaluating other possible explanations for why tree choice doesn't have a big impact on LEV in this particular system. So this is kind of a question and kind of a bouncing ideas off you to think about in the future. Sure. But I think about systems where the selection of trees during thinning has a big impact on LEV. They tend to be things like specialty hardwood systems where choosing to take this tree now and leave that tree can be the difference between growing a veneer tree and a sawlog tree, which could be a 5 or 10 times difference in wood value. Whereas in Douglas-fir, you're talking more about 10 or 20% differences in wood value across those things. So I'm wondering if even accounting for spatial variability, if you think there would be enough variability and potential sort of growth of value in response to different thinning conditions to end up having an effect after you wash off all of the just error in estimating tree growth and things like that in this kind of a system.
Yes, I think really what you're saying is that this is the 10-minute version of a 50-minute talk. So there are a number of things that stand out to me in what you said. The first one is in relation to this call out that I made about economic modeling. What the analysis here is running on when it computes all of these curves is it's looking at just 2 saw, 3 saw, and 4 saw. There's this complicated discussion that we're having about mill data and can we accurately model special mill or higher sorts well enough to include that in the pricing. But as you pointed out, the price range in Douglas-fir between the sorts is relatively small. So it's unlikely it's going to make large differences in the decision making unless you're specifically saying, I'm growing through these trees for this timber sort, and that's my management objective, as opposed to just general financial maximization. The second component is what I see when I map out the actual cuts on the stands is that this pattern where you plant it on a 3.2 meter grid and Organon is going through and picking, I want to take this tree and I want to take that tree, because there's no physical way that the machine can actually do that. There are trees in the way, it can't reach there and so on. So getting the spatial model in is probably not going to change the structure of this analysis because that constraint applies in the proportional thinning side as well. What it does do is it says, maybe you already have equipment corridors in the unit that you want to honor, or can you really get this? Is it actually down here somewhere? Because yes, there's a tree that's optimal for you to take, but you have to cut 3 or 4 non-optimal trees out to get to that tree. So it's not so much that you might be able to find ways to make more money, as it is this state of tooling right now. If you were to program it into your harvester and you have your heads-up display that's helping the harvester pilot do the cutting, they're probably going to go, I can't do anything with this. So we want to make it that usable tool. And that also begins to get into the ability of saying, oh, you know, this tree has a fork top, or this tree has some other interesting structure. And that might be something where we want to give that tree higher priority as a habitat tree and retain it. But then we have to plan for the equipment to go around it, such. A broad question. I hope that touches on most of the things you mentioned.
Sorry, I was muted. It looks like we have time for one more quick question. Darius, do you want to go ahead?
Todd, I apologize. I should have read the paper before. So 3 quick questions.
Sure.
Are the runs that you're showing were conducted at, the LEVs were computed at these 2 and 3% discount rates?
2 up to 8. So you got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8.
And at the 8% level, do you consistently opt for a thinning when presented the alternative?
So with this analysis, the 8% is not profitable. So there's no trajectories offered because you just wouldn't go there. It's like, go do something else with the land. What does change that is if you include some of the reforestation tax breaks that are available, then you can get enough money back on the reforestation cost to just squeak in a really quick rotation.
Okay, but is there a discount rate at which it's not optimal to thin, but to?
Yeah. What you're seeing here is where there's a single dot, that's just a no thin at all. And where there's, you know, these 2 dots, those are double thins. So if you go up to the original analysis here, for example, here, this is a 30-year rotation on thin, 35-year rotation bend, and then it switches over to doing 2 thins. Okay. And this analysis could be extended to more thins. We have a question going on right now about how far we want to look and how do we manage the millions of combinations that would result.
Got it. So I apologize. I should have looked at the paper in advance. Second question is about yields. Do these thinnings produce what is it that the mensurationists call it, bonus wood? So if you thin, do you end up at the end of a lengthening of a longer rotation with a higher volume at that age than you would have if you left the stand without thinning?
Generally, no, right? Because when you're taking off photosynthetic plant because you killed the tree, typically, you know, there's less carbon fixation that's going to happen. What does happen a little bit is that if you look at a non-optimized thin, or at least a simply optimized thin, like the kind of thing you might go to and do an FDS or organon today versus this individual tree selection, is that most of this increase in LEV comes from the heuristic finding ways to move volume earlier in the rotation so that it's less discounted. But if you compare the total volume harvested on one of these trajectories to one of the heuristic trajectories, oftentimes the heuristic trajectories pick up a 2 or 3% more volume as well. However, sometimes the heuristics actually make more money with less wood.
Yeah, okay. Because there are some yield models, for example, that consistently show this bonus wood phenomenon, and there's a real question about it, which I'm sure you're aware of.
I mean, organon is not.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to cut you guys off and ask you to continue the conversation over email because we got to move on and keep on track. But thank you so much for your talk and for the great questions. Our next speaker is Mandira Pokharel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. And she'll be presenting about timber faller safety on integrated mechanized operations in steep terrain. You can go ahead and share your screen and begin speaking whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Mandira. I'm a second-year master's student in FORM. I work with Dr. Francisca Villat, and the research project that I'm presenting here today is about the timber safety and integrated mechanized operations in steep terrain. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. So timber falling is one of the most dangerous occupation of the world. The numbers here is showing the data from 2017 of United States, when logging was actually recorded as the second dangerous job after fishing. But at present, with the introduction and development of mechanization, the condition of workers is much improved. It's mainly because the workers who used to be outside in the ground with being exposed to all the dangers are now working from inside the protected machine cabin with the systems such as the falling object protection system, which is a lot safer. And these technologies also have other numerous benefits like increased productivity due to preventing, and it requires less people. But despite of that, we still need people underground. The machines has limitations, and there are areas like very steep slope, rocky outcrops, and shallow soil, which do not allow machine to access the area. So hand fallers should go to such place and fall the trees manually. And with that, there are a lot of research being conducted focusing on productivity, cost effectiveness, environmental impact, and mechanics and safety to operate this new technology. However, it's been identified that the research about potential impact on timber faller safety under this new scenario is pretty limited. So the goal of our study is to identify the change in work environment for hand fallers with the adoption of new technologies and mixing it with hand falling. And with the available anecdotal information, we have hypothesized that integration of mechanized harvesting and hand falling is potentially leaving the worst terrain to hand fallers. And with this project, we intend to answer the question, are timber fallers consistently working in more difficult terrain when working in mixed mechanized operations? So these are our specific objectives. The first one is to assess the difference in terrain features between hand-felled and mechanically harvested area, to identify the regions for requiring hand falling, and to determine the proportion of hand-felled areas and the sequence of two systems. For this study, we are working with two different data sets. The first one is 3 non-harvested units from the industrial forest land of Northern Oregon Coast Range, and second is 6 post-harvest units which were harvested like 1 or 2 years ago, also located in the same area. We have quantitative as well as qualitative data, and we're analyzing the quantitative data with a linear mixed effect model with unit as the random effects, and qualitative data with thematic content analysis, which is basically an approach to find a common pattern across the data set. So this is a schematic figure of layout of plots in one unit. 50 plots are located systematically over the unit with GIS, covering the variations including terrain features and different harvesting systems. Each plot was circular with a radius of 16.75 feet. The non-harvested unit from Eucalyptus vegetarian data are still being harvested. So we have it to figure out which of our plots are hand-filled or machine-filled. And these are our response variable measured in each plot. Slope, which could be an important aspect affecting safety directly or indirectly, and can also be one of the main reasons for requiring hand-filling. And average soil depth, as too shallow soil cannot provide traction to operate the heavy equipment and hence require hand-filling. And hazard trees, including snags and leaning trees, which are one of the most prominent regions of causing casualties of fallers, as identified by several researchers. And we also measure the devious and unusual features like rocky outcrops. Okay, so for the qualitative data, we are interviewing timber fallers and harvest managers with a set of open-ended questionnaires to complement the information from forest and terrain assessment. The question for the fallers are designed with the aim of assessing their perception about working in integrated operations and the regions for requiring hand-filling. And for harvest managers, the questionnaire is mainly designed to get information regarding the decision making and planning to harvest our study units. As I mentioned earlier, the forests are still being harvested, so we are not able to analyze all the data now, but we have some preliminary results from the analysis of post-harvest maps. So for the first objective of assessing the difference in terrain features, I did the linear mix effect analysis of the relation between slope and the falling methods, with falling methods as the fixed effect and unit as the random effect. You can see here in the coefficient table that coefficient table of fixed effect that the mean estimate of slope of an area with a mechanical falling method is about 29 units lower than that of the hand-fill area. The box plot here is also supporting that. The red boxes representing the hand-fill area and the median lines here is higher than that for the machine fill area in almost all the units. Some of the points seems like an outlier here, but I did the visual inspection of the data and there was no obvious deviation from our assumptions like homoscedasticity or normality. And by the likelihood ratio test of the full model with the falling methods against the model without falling method, we obtained this p-value, which is basically the lowest value that R gives for a p-value, suggesting that the slope is significantly different in different falling methods. So for the second objectives, these are the regions that we have come across until now from our interviews. The first one is the poorly stuffed area, which makes it unproductive or too expensive for the machine to set up, and the area is too steep for the machine, or a new operator running the equipment with we have identified when new operator is running the equipment, that they are basically able to cover the less area than the experienced operator, hence requiring more areas of hand falling. And the difficult topographical features like rocky area and height walls or incised draws and short slope leading to stream, which make a machine inefficient and environmentally damaging. For the third objective of determining the proportion of hand fill area, we can see here in the chart that the proportion of hand-filled part is higher than that of the machine-filled part in all of the 6 units. And about the sequence of two fallings, the mechanical falling took place ahead of hand falling in 4 units, and 2 systems were concurrent with each other in rest of the 2 units. So from the initial results that we have, we can state that the hand fallers are now consistently working in the steeper terrain in our study area, and hand falling is being done before or along with the mechanical falling. The best management and operating practices for steep slope machine logging have actually stated that when machine go first, they can create and add new hazards to the fallers. For instance, fallers are exposed to the increased risks of rolling logs, rocks, and other chunks on slope, and also to the increased risks of wind-blown trees, standing trees with broken limbs and tree trunks due to the action of the machine. And about the broader significance of a study, I think that the main point is we are actually putting numbers to the existing stories or anecdotal information about the new working condition for hand fallers. This complements the limited information for implementing safety measures underground during integrated mechanized operations. And we'll also assist the stakeholders, including the private forest owners, like industrial landowners, while making specific decisions regarding improving working conditions for hand fallers. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you all for listening. And I'll be happy to answer if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. Very nice. We do have some time for questions. If people would like to type them into the chat or raise their hand, and I can unmute you so you can ask verbally.
Hello, Mandira. How are you? I'm Tak. I'm a faculty from FES. Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask this question. It might sound a little bit off topic, not so off topic. It might sound a bit irrelevant. But so you found that they use hand when it's slope, but that's been known before you're gonna do analysis. So I wonder, since you have data and statistic analysis, what other factors statistically potentially matters? Do you think you can answer this question? Again, so that I think so anyone can probably guess, and you confirm that slope matters. The slope is probably the #1 reason that they use hand. But if you have good data set, and if you let's say, okay, remove the slope, is there any other factors drive the use of hand falling rather than machine falling? And I wonder if you have some ideas to explore more of the problem. Yeah, I thought this is a qualitative explanation, but I wonder if you can explain us if you can do quantitative analysis on this.
Okay, so one of the response variable we have is soil depth. We have measured that in the non-harvested unit, which is still being harvested again. So after it's harvested, we will find out which of our plots was in fall with which system, and then compare between those two. If we found out that as I said, the sorry, shallow soil cannot provide traction for the heavy equipment, and that can be one of the reasons for requiring hand pulling. Or the rocky terrain. Yeah, so we have the unusual features also where we recorded if the terrain is too rocky, or if there's anything like in some place it was like wetland with all the wet soil and this high soil moisture content, which will definitely does not allow the machine to access. So after the analysis of that non-harvested unit, we will be able to figure out if these other response variables has their impact in deciding which pollen to use. And I think the other reason might be our study area is the industrial forest land, and it may also depend on the budget of the industry or their specific plan about which system to use. So yeah.
Thank you.
We have one more question in the chat from Francisca Bellart, who says, Mandira, what is the next step in your data collection?
So the next step would be to find out which of our plots was filled by which of the two systems, and then compare between those two and find out if it's significantly different. Yeah.
Probably one more question.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you, Mandira.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is basically when you talk of the safety of falling trees in using either hand falling or tree falling, have you really considered some data on injuries to be able to say that hand falling is preferred on this terrain as opposed to machine falling?
I'm not sure I understand your question correctly, but we are, we have reviewed literatures about the injury records of hand falling in different terrain, but it's not in our data analysis and result part.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering those questions. Our next presenter is Jun Zhai. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Jun will be talking to us about the incidence of domestic subsidies and export taxes, an equilibrium displacement model of log and lumber markets in Oregon. And I forgot to mention that Jun is from the Department of Forest Engineering and Resource Management. So you are free to share your screen and begin speaking whenever you are ready, Jun.
Do we need to wait for a few minutes or we start right now?
You know, you're right. We could probably give people a couple more minutes to
Okay.
filter.
Yeah.
Until 2:50, just so no one misses the
Okay.
first minutes of your talk. Good catch. This is our last presentation of the day. It's been amazing to hear everyone's research. And I appreciate so many people sticking through this long event to see what all of our students have been doing. It's so interesting.
Should I share my video or I can turn off the video?
You can do whatever you'd like. I think it's nice to see the video if you don't mind.
Okay. Okay, so thank you everybody for still being here. I'm the last presenter. My topic today is the incidence of domestic subsidies and export tax using the equilibrium displacement model to study the log and lumber market in Oregon. The softwood log, the softwood log exports has been a very important component of the forest industry in Oregon because it at most accounts for 16% of the log production in 2013, which create revenues for the Oregon economy. However, the softwood log exports from Oregon is also very volatile because it is subjected to political and economic changes. For example, the Morse Agreement of 1968 dedicated that the annual export volume of logs from the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management in Washington and Oregon should be below 350 million board feet. Then the first Appropriations Act of 1974 made a comprehensive ban on the export of logs harvested from the federal forest lands in the west of Honduras Meridian. The most recent policy is the Forest Resource Conservation and Shortage Relief Act of 1990. It banned the export of unprocessed logs from state-owned forest lands. As a result, in states like Washington and Oregon, only logs from private forest lands are currently allowed for exports. Here are the destination countries of the exported logs. They are the countries in the Pacific Rims, which include Japan, China, and South Korea. In figure 1 here, the red line represents Japan, the yellow line represents China, and the blue line represents South Korea. There's a great decline in the quantity of log exported because of the listing of spotted owl as Endangered Species Act in the 1990s. Seen from figure 1, even though after or before 1990s, Japan has been the largest and most stable log buyers because there are large wooden structures in Japan. They import logs from Pacific Northwest for specialized post and beam construction. China did not import as much as softwood logs before the Great Recession. However, after the Great Recession, China surpassed Japan and became the largest softwood log importers. South Korea has been constantly import softwood logs for construction and carpentry application. However, because of their economy size, the import volume is relatively low. The purpose of log export restrictions, like the policies we mentioned in the first slide, is to develop the local forest industry by promoting the wood processing in Oregon and thus create more employment. Besides, these restrictions can also mitigate climate changes by replacing carbon-intensive materials such as concrete and steel, and realize the long-term storage of carbon in manufactured wood products. Therefore, in my study, I think up of 3 alternative policies to realize the objective of the development of wood processing and mitigate climate changes, which are a log export tax, a subsidy paid to mills, and a subsidy paid to lumber consumers. They are hypothetical, which are not placed right now. Here are my research questions. The first 2 questions are, what are the market implications of the hypothetical log export tax, subsidy to mills, and subsidy to lumber consumers in Oregon? The third research question is, how do such tax and subsidy compare in terms of their welfare and market implications? Here are some literature review to see what others have done in this area. Instead of treating the log and lumber market as separate markets, Wiseman and Sojo in 1981 started a hypothetical export embargo on softwood logs from the Pacific Northwest by considering the feedback effects from the lumber market on log price. They find that the percentage changes in log and lumber price are much smaller when considering the feedback effects other than not. Another study is by Lin and Zhang studied the incidence of the log export tax in Russia. Starting in 2006, the tax amounts gradually increased from 6.5% to 25% by 2008, which plans to ultimately increase it to 80% by 2010. However, the Great Recession and Russia's accession to the World Trade Center resulted in a reduction in export taxes to 8% in 2015. They find that for 1% of log export tax, the domestic log price decreases by 0.45%. The log export price increases by 0.55%, and the lumber price decreases by 0.34%. Additionally, they find that the tax revenue is around $3 billion between January 2007 to July 2012, and there's a net welfare gain of $742 million for the Russian economy. John and others started the hypothetical tariff of 25% tax tariff imposed by China on the U.S. forest products. They find that annual economic losses of $742 million for their U.S. forest landowners because of the lower domestic log price. They also find the lumber and veneer consumers gain an annual economic benefit of around $1.8 billion and $72 million respectively because of the lower lumber and veneer price. The effects of subsidy has been widely studied in areas of bioenergy. So Jolie and others in 2010 studied the effect of tax on fossil fuel and subsidies on promoting bioenergy production from wood and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Norway. They found that both subsidies to bioenergy production or consumption or tax on fossil fuels increase bioenergy production from wood. Besides, the subsidy to bioenergy is the most efficient measure to increase the total consumption of biofuel, and tax on fossil fuel is the most effective measure to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. Considering the limit of time, I'll skip the data and method part and go straight to the result part. Same as the previous studies in the literature review, we consider the feedback effects from the lumber market on their log price. Table 1 should have shown the percentages in price and quantities for 1% tax, 1% subsidy to males, and 1% subsidy to lumber consumers. Because of the time limit, I just show the percent changes in some prices for 1% of tax and subsidy. In the third column shows the percent changes for a 1% tax. The log price in Oregon would drop by 0.24% for the imposition of a 1% tax, whereas the log export price increases by 0.78%. The lumber price in Oregon will decrease by 0.16%. In the fourth column, that's the subsidy to males. We can see the log export price increases by 0.30%, whereas the log price received by males decreased by 0.70% because of the subsidy. The lumber market price decreases by 0.48%. The last column here shows the results from the subsidy paid to lumber consumers. The market log price goes up by 0.09%, and the market lumber price goes up by 0.9% as well. However, the lumber price received by lumber consumers decreases by 0.91%. Here's the result of the welfare changes based on the percent changes in price and quantity in table 1 and citing other parameters. I will not explain the welfare changes of every participants. You can talk with me after the presentation if you're interested. Let's take a look at the tax revenue and subsidy cost. For 1% of tax, the tax revenue is $3.24 million a year for 1% of subsidy to males. The subsidy amount amounts to $18.41 million for 1% subsidy to lumber consumers. Their subsidy cost is $7.04 million. The net welfare changes in Oregon in the three cases are negative $0.54 million, negative $8.25 million, and $1.9 million. As we mentioned above, the objective of these policies are to promote the economic development and mitigate climate changes. So using the values from table 1, table 2, and citing some conversion factors from other sources, I calculate the average cost of CO2 by dividing the net welfare change in Oregon by the volume of CO2 sequestered in wood products. The average cost of CO2 is $11.18 per metric ton in the case of 10% tax, $56.92 per metric ton in the case of 10% subsidy to males. Their net welfare change in Oregon is positive in the case of subsidy paid to lumber consumers, so we don't calculate the average cost here. The effect on employment include changes in male employment and changes in forestry employment. In total, there's a loss of 21 jobs in their tax case, a gain of 957 jobs in their subsidy to males, and a gain of 329 jobs in the subsidy to lumber consumers. In conclusion, we find that subsidizing lumber consumers seems to be the best policy alternative, since it leads to gains in employment, economic return, and additional carbon stored. Subsidizing males has the largest impact in terms of additional jobs, but such a policy comes at the cost of high subsidy payments. And the log export tax is the most cost-effective method in promoting the storage of additional carbon, and it's the policy to generate revenues for Oregon. One of the limitations is that our study only modeled the storage of CO2 in lumber products without taking other pathways into account. The use of wood products can reduce CO2 by sequestering CO2 in standing forest, storing CO2 in forest product, replacing traditional fossil fuel with bioenergy, substituting carbon-intensive products, and then storing waste wood in landfills, but we only consider the case of storage of CO2 in lumber products. Future research could include other vertical and horizontal market linkage between various products, such as lumber, plywood veneer, and pulp chips. That's basically all I have in this presentation. I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. This is great. Yeah, anyone is welcome to type questions into the chat or raise your hand to be unmuted. And we'll have about 5 minutes to take some questions before we're wrapped up.
Maybe no more question.
Yeah, I've got a quick question for you.
Okay.
You skipped over the methods in the interest of time. I'm just wondering if you could just sort of quickly summarize them, sort of what you did.
You mean the method part?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I used the equilibrium displacement model, as I mentioned this in the title only, equilibrium displacement model. So this model, the benefit of this model is to consider the feedback effects from the lumber market on the log price. By considering the interaction together, we can get, because this, if we have the tax, then the tax is on the log market, but there's no tax on the lumber market. By using this model, we can see the effect of the tax on the lumber market and on the log market on two markets. So that's the benefit of this model.
Great.
Does that answer
yes,
your question?
Thanks very much.
We do have time for another question if anyone has one. Seeing any more hands raised? Well, I am going to stay in this chat for another 5 minutes if anyone does have questions for June or has any questions about turning in feedback forms for me after that. I'll just be here until I end the session. Yeah, I really want to thank everyone for coming to watch these talks and of course to all the presenters for giving these amazing talks about their work. It was really interesting to hear and certainly makes me very proud to be part of the College of Forestry. So very inspiring. Stop our recording here.